So last week was drugs, and this week is food, so maybe next week will have to be administration. No, that's a stupid joke. Going all the way back to the wake-up call that got me started on this in the first place, I had the thought that I wish we could have what I would call a foodie moment for relationships and civic engagement. You go back far enough, and I am old enough to vaguely remember this, and the United States of America was the land of McDonald's and Velveeta. And we were a people who had almost completely lost our food heritage, and it was a positive choice. It was something we aspired to. A home-cooked meal was very, very old-fashioned, very out of date. With television, came the TV dinner. And so families would buy their TV trays, and they would eat in the living room on their TV trays, and the TV dinners were frozen. They just had to be popped into the oven, or, even more up to date, the microwave. And there were things like Wonder Bread, and there were Lunchables. And this was as futuristic as rockets going to the moon. And if you actually took basic ingredients and you made dishes out of them, it meant you were either a grandparent who was still a penny pincher, probably you were a survivor of the Great Depression, or you were the kind of curmudgeon, the kind of laggard in the S-curve from the diffusion of innovations that preferred to actually go out and do your business in a wooden outhouse instead of having indoor plumbing. Those were the associations with actually cooking. And the manufactured, processed food that we were eating was all very unhealthy. And we led the world in obesity and hypertension. And I still remember around the probably late 1990s, I think it was, the Triplets of Belleville. I got a copy of that. It may have been later than the 1990s, but I read all these great reviews about this film, and I got a DVD of it. I bought it off Amazon, and all through it, the stereotype, you could tell, because this was a cartoon that had no words. It was wordless. It did everything with images and with music, but you could tell when a character was American because the Americans were all obese. And I think everyone is aware of the public health crisis that is obesity, and it's spread beyond the United States, and it's on all 7 continents now, that in the future, countries all over the world have to deal with how can they improve people's eating habits and get them to be more active. But it really did start out in the United States. And in some sense, I can see where this logic came from. I mean, I do enjoy reading printed books more than I do necessarily reading handwritten copies of literary works. Sometimes something being manufactured is very, very liberating. And so when we got to where we could manufacture food, it could come out of a factory. It could be very uniform. And you could do things with flavor so that the flavor was very sharp, the consistency was very consistent, the mouthfeel was very consistent, I guess is what I was trying to say, and it was all very predictable. And you could have 10 cans or 10 packages of the same food product, and all 10 be the same. The first time that happens, that's really, really exciting. I mean, the first time you hold in your hand an iPhone, and it'll do all these things, it's really, really exciting. And then you find yourself in 2017 wondering, what is the next iPhone going to do? Because it has to push back the boundaries some more, but they've been reduced to incremental improvements that are not revolutionary anymore. So maybe part of it is that manufactured food, it was exciting when it arrived because it was the wave of the future. But once the newness wore off, something happened that I would love to see us find a way to reproduce. We found our food heritage again. We took a step back from Wonder Bread and Velveeta and McDonald's. And I'm not saying that nobody eats at McDonald's anymore. McDonald's profits, as I understand it from following them in the news, are falling off. They're suffering. They may have reached the end of a very long and very impressive winning streak. And I don't think they're going to go out of business. I think there are a lot of adaptations that can keep them afloat. But the old model of how they produced food is not bringing on the success that it used to bring on. And now we have a foodie movement. And I will say, just getting started, that the foodie movement has its absurdities. And there are some people who take fascination with preparing food and being artisans of food. They take it to extremes. But it is virtually never really a good idea, coherent or fair, to take an idea and judge it by the people who are unbalanced with it. It's never really in order to take the extreme version of a proposition and let that form your opinion of it. So one of the reasons I think that the foodie movement got off the ground was television. You know, television brought on the TV dinner, but television also, it was food TV shows that, in the first place, food photographs really well if you tart it up a little bit. I mean, you have to use a few tricks of the trade, and a lot of the food that looks the most impressive on camera is completely inedible because what they had to do to make it look that good. But people wanted pleasure, and they wanted sensation, and they wanted novelty, and food can provide that. And the TV shows that showed how the preparation happened, well, sooner or later, all your mirror neurons fire, and you want to go out and you want to start doing that yourself. So maybe you pick up a couple of books. Really, I think what's more likely in 2017 is you watch about a dozen YouTube videos, and then you go and you start getting messy in the kitchen, and just like picking up a musical instrument, noodling around with it for the first time, you make a couple of things in the kitchen, some of them turn out well, they point the direction to how to do it better, and pretty soon you are off to the races, you're a foodie. And as far as pleasure and sensation and novelty, it reminds me really of, at some points in our history in the United States, but even more so in Europe, there was a fascination with visual art. And so people would get absolutely, that their lives would be filled up with pursuing who was the painter who would do the most astonishing, most challenging, most stimulating thing with their art form. And people would define themselves, and people would find meaning and satisfaction and excitement in their lives from pursuing painters. And I think, I don't think it's, There are problems with this analogy. The analogy breaks down at some point. I don't think anyone responds to Gordon Ramsay the way they responded to Vincent van Gogh, but it is the case that there's always more out there, and it has a lot to do with surprise, and it has a lot to do with appeal to the senses. The other thing I think about our need for a foodie movement, for relationships and civic engagement, is I think if we're ever going to get back to where we have some healthy habits surrounding all of this, what we've got to do, we've got to aspire, not fear. We've got to rearrange our behaviors to where we feel motivated to do more of what we're doing, not to where we feel a need to try to stomp out what we have been doing. I think we need not necessarily to repent. I think we need to turn a corner and go a different direction. And you may think that those are two different ways of saying the same thing, but let me put it this way. I don't think I've used this illustration in this particular podcast before, but if I have, okay, I'm reviewing it. I learned years ago, because I have a certain fascination with literature on behavioral training, animal behavior, how humans and animals communicate to one another nonverbally. And I remember seeing the explanation that just clicked with me right away. You don't teach an animal not to do something. You're much better off teaching an animal a behavior that's inconsistent with what you don't want them doing. So if you don't want your dog jumping up on visitors at the door, you don't teach them don't jump up on people. They don't understand that. But you could teach them by giving them a treat, that if they'll go and they'll lie down in a designated spot on that command, they'll get the treat every time. And then if you give the command and they lie down and they're excited because they're about to get a treat, they don't necessarily notice they're not jumping up on someone at the door. So what I think we've got to do is, if we were to get to a point where we could have a foodie movement in relationships, we would be proud and excited and motivated about what we were doing, and we would not feel the burden, the discouraging, defeating burden of what we are doing is bad and we've got to change it. And I think right now, for too many of us, we are stuck in this place where we think what we're doing is bad and we've got to change it. And that is just not an energizing way to think about it. If you think about, my diet is so awful, I eat so unhealthy, I eat so much red meat, I go to McDonald's too often and I eat Wonder Bread, which is all processed and is probably giving me diabetes. And if you think about that, and that weighs over you, that's like a ton of weight on your shoulders, but these are habits and they're ingrained, then it takes a whole lot of very uncertain and it takes a whole lot of dread and facing up to the dread and forcing your way through the dread to make positive, constructive change. If, on the other hand, you watch a lot of cooking TV shows, and boy, does that look exciting, and wow, look how easy that is, and you start to play with a little of it, and you realize you can take actually very healthy foods. You can take vegetables and fruits, and you can do simple things to them to bring their flavor out. And wow, this is exciting, and you're working with your hands, and this is so satisfying, and almost without you knowing it, you start substituting that for all the McDonald's and the Velveeta and the Wonder Bread, and your weight comes off, and you have more energy, and in all sorts of ways you feel healthy, and you never had to face up to the dread of what I'm currently doing is not working. Something that my psychology professor colleague says every time she can work it into conversation is, whatever behavior you reinforce is what you will see more of. The behavior you reinforce, you'll see more of. One of the reasons that I really don't want to fight anymore with Donald Trump or Donald Trump supporters is that fighting is for them reinforcing. Fighting fits right in to how they view the world. And they've configured their identity to where they are fighting. And they are affirmed when they fight. And so the more you fight, the more you're gonna fight. And I don't hold out the hope that I can somehow fight so effectively that I can win the fight, there'll be no further fights. I am not that naive. But every time I go out to conduct even a limited fight, every time I engage and participate in the fight, I don't know if this is allergies or just what it is, but I know that I am laying the foundation, paving the way for more fighting. What's far more difficult than reinforcement is to extinguish a behavior that's ingrained and established, so I think we got to do it another way. The funny thing is, the thing that's really, really kind of puzzling when you start to think in this direction is so much of our culture is configured, it's aimed at how wonderful friendship is. If you think about television and film and advertising images, it's not as though we circulate the message to one another that people are unpleasant, that people need to all be the same. That's really not an idea that has a lot of currency. Instead, the idea that I think most folks would recognize and would identify with is people are wonderful and they don't have to all be the same. The trick, the one piece of the puzzle that I think is missing, we hunger for friendship. We crave friendship, but we want it with our own circle of people. We want it with a relatively compact in-group. And we don't seem to want friendly bonds, friendly behavior more generally. I think somewhere deep down, we want enemies to go along with our friendships. We want to know who our enemies are because we and our friends can tighten that bond by being united against the enemies. And there are some days I think that may be part of what's driving this, and other days I don't think it is at all. Another possibility that I entertain sometimes, it seems as though a lot of people want to be quick to interpret difference as a threat, to circulate and endorse and buy into fear. It's almost as though people who are horror movie fans, that may be the fad right now as far as dominant narratives. That there are too many of us, a critical mass of us, who want to live in a horror movie. That some way, for some reason, we find the fear affirming. Or that might not be it. It might be that we're only looking for an excuse for public anger. We're looking for a domain, for a context in which it is acceptable for us to express anger against a scapegoat. And this, I think I've mentioned before in a previous episode. There was a time when you could take it out on the other races. They could be your scapegoat, and you could express all kinds of anger, disdain, contempt, and you could find there were other people who would agree with you, and it was all very socially respectable. You could be an office holder. You could be appointed to the Supreme Court. There were a couple of members of the Senate and a couple of Supreme Court justices. Justice Hugo Black was, in his young adult years, a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And that was an outlet where you could vent your anger and really your hatred. And you could look down on those who were inferior and show your contempt for them. So maybe we have all of this bottled up anxiety and insecurity, and we feel a drive to vent it, that old misguided belief in the venting hypothesis. And if we take political difference, political disagreement, if we take variant in political position, and we construct those others into enemies, then maybe it's acceptable for us to hate our political enemies. It shouldn't be. I started all the way back at the beginning of this saying that the cornerstone of my foundation here is that it is not okay to hate. It's not okay to hate because of what my faith teaches me. And it's not okay to hate because people who live side by side in a political order, but they then constitute their interactions around hating one another, the only thing they're going to do is they're going to tear that political order apart. And we went through about 150 years ago, a little over 150 years ago, a very near miss on exactly that. In Lincoln's day, the political order had become constituted around polarized sides that expressed open hatred for one another. And all of the really, really radical surgery that we had to go through to carve that out and to neutralize the parts that were powerful, I am not optimistic that we necessarily would survive it a second time. I mean, I think that the United States has been resilient. I think that people want a stable order and people want to be happy and safe. And those drives will take you a long way toward addressing unbalances of that kind. But I'm not sure they'll take you all the way. At any rate, the thing about foodies, to get back to the foodie analogy, foodies are constantly rediscovering foods that people hated when they were children, but doing new things with them, reframing them, looking at them a different way, preparing them a different way, flavoring them a different way, and saying, wow, why did nobody ever show me that it could be like this? So if you ever had okra when you were a child and it was all slimy, and then someone makes for you fried okra. I have lived in the Deep South and I have had fried okra, and I'm here to tell you it's good. If you've ever had Brussels sprouts and thought Brussels sprouts were awful because they were cooked until they were bitter, well, I mean, I actually eat Brussels sprouts raw, because if you don't cook them until they turn bitter, I think they taste actually pretty good. But there are ways you can prepare them, very creative ways, where you can reclaim them. And something you would have been tempted to hate, something you were trained and habituated to hate, you can see completely differently. And this is the part that I think has potential, the accomplishment of having looked on this that you hated before, having rethought it, having done the creative act of preparing it a different way, experimenting with different preparation techniques, putting different sauces and spices and ingredients with it, and then discovering you did it. You took something you hated and you made it something that you loved. And you made it something that was satisfying, and you could show it to other people and prepare it for other people. And one of the reasons that I think this foodie analogy works is you prepare your food for other people, and people gather around a table and they enjoy the food. And that's one of the ways that people have come together and forged relationships and enjoyed one another's company, going all the way back to the dawn of the human race. So what I think is, I think that we have got to somehow reach a tipping point to where what we take pride in, what enlarges our identity, is the deliberate choice to seek out and understand truths that we don't like, truths that we dread and don't want to face up to. I've mentioned before a few times that if you were to put me on the left-right political spectrum, which has problems, but it's useful if you don't try to put too much stress on it, if you don't try to use it to explain too many things. But if you put me on that spectrum, I would be down on the left end. And I think people in my political neighborhood who want to use the resources of government and want to take the collected wealth of a community and put in place a safety net that takes care of the most at risk and the most needy who can't necessarily fend for themselves in a highly competitive marketplace, I have to admit, there are horror stories, basically. There are cautionary tales all over Europe of just that kind of safety net having grown through the inertia of bureaucracy, through people extending their own careers by doing more of what they were hired to do, to where those things became unsustainable, to where they became dysfunctional. And I have to face up to that, and I can't dismiss that, and I can't pretend that if I acknowledge that, I'm somehow handing ammunition to my opponents. That argument has teeth. And I have got to have the courage to say, yes, I do know about that, and I do know that we've got to be careful, that we've got to proceed with those dangers in mind. And I think that people on all parts of that spectrum, and really it would be better conceived of as a full two-dimensional space and possibly a three-dimensional space. I'm not sure we could conceive it as a four-dimensional space. But people in all those political positions, however you arrange them relative to one another, I think we could reach this foodie movement. One of the most important enabling conditions would be if we could spread the idea that when you face up to the facts that make you uncomfortable, and when you engage in the kind of nuanced thinking that includes making space for those facts that make you uncomfortable, then you can talk to people who are far away from you in that political space. You can talk to people who believe very differently from you if they'll do the same thing. And the two of you can have some really pretty satisfying relationships with one another. I also think that we would have to get to the point where we could circulate narratives about waiting, about delayed gratification, discipline, sticking with things. One of the reasons I keep coughing so much is when I was younger, I had a very, very mild case of asthma. I had my last full-blown attack more than 30 years ago. But I do, after a whole lot of exercise, I'll sometimes wheeze for a day or two, and just yesterday, less than 24 hours ago, I ran a half marathon. And that was the latest development in a 6-year path of hard work. I took up running only very far into my adulthood. I was in my 40s before I ever stepped outside and ran for exercise. Apart from when I was a child and still in grade school and still in physical education. After that, when I was an adult, I never ran. But I do now, and little by little over the years, it built. Now the problem, and it's part of the same logic that made Velveeta and Wonder Bread and McDonald's so attractive, is we have so many things where you can have instant gratification. We have so many things where you can cut out the waiting period. But we have had some successes in things becoming fashionable that take time. And so there are people who are learning to play musical instruments, which you cannot do in 1 second. There are hipsters pursuing hipster hobbies where, honestly, you've got to spend some time learning your craft. All of these foodies who learn how to cook. There are lots of resources out there that can demonstrate what the baby steps are. What's the first thing that you can do that is easy, borders on foolproof, and you can have something you can serve to other people and you can all enjoy together. If you succeeded with that, then you take another baby step forward. You try something a little more difficult, but it's still a process that takes time. Can we circulate the idea that we can talk to other people about important public civic issues a little bit at a time? Can we not only, not try to respond to the dread that there's something wrong in our public life, but can we step forward feeling excited, feeling energized, like discovering, I haven't even mentioned music, but there are some people where music is their obsession, and they discover a new band, and then they hungrily consume that new band, and they go through the band's entire catalog, and then they discover another band. And always it's a quest to find somebody to where the creation that appeals to their senses has novelty, and when they are consuming and experiencing those cultural products, they feel really, really excited. Is there a way we could do that with conversation? Is there a way we could do that with civic engagement? I mean, I guess part of the problem is that visual art and food and music, those all bypass our reasoning. Those are not explicit. They're not semantically encoded. They're experienced. But the idea that gave the name to this podcast is that the content is not all there is to the encounter. There is also the relationship. And I lived in a very rural part of the country where I was one of only a bare handful of people in the entire city who had my political views. And I can't say that I heard anything from any of my neighbors that made me want to change my opinion about any particular political issue. But it was enjoying their company. And it was the first-hand experience of that person in all of that person's complexity, in all of that person's attractiveness and flaws, all of that person's best features and blemishes. That person was a work of art. And when we could talk about anything, when we could talk about the conditions under which we live together, not that we did so that often, because there is still the taboo that you don't talk about politics and you don't talk about religion. But really in a small town, you definitely can talk about religion, and it's surprising how often you can talk about politics. Could we talk about all the diversity out there, all the different, new, exciting people we can encounter? We're at a point in our growing use, our growing dependence, honestly, on digital devices, where we do a lot of our communication through social networking platforms, although I am really encouraged by the fact that most of the people on my friend list on Facebook post fewer and fewer things. They do it when they've got something really that departs from the ordinary, something that's not every day. That's the kind of stuff they post now. Just to digress for a second, I've read on a number of occasions that when light bulbs were first invented, there were people who would go and they would take field trips. Someone in the neighborhood had a light bulb, and they would walk around the light bulb and stare at the light bulb and ooh and ah over the light bulb. And then we completely domesticated light bulbs, and they faded into the background. And then, of course, there were too many years where people would spend all their time under fluorescent lights and didn't understand that natural light was actually better than human-created light. But there came a point where we did understand that, and we restored the balance. And maybe I should be a little bit hopeful that even though for a period we did just about all of our, not just about all, but we did, I would argue, too much of our communicating online through digital devices, I think what I am seeing is a certain rebalancing and a certain appreciation for the fact that there are shortcomings to this, and it is shiny and new. But people used to like to drive through, there are too many people. I am a Sherry Turkle fan. I don't think she's right about everything, but I think she's right about a lot of things. And she says that people are fighting by text message because it's predictable and because they're in control. But people used to drive through McDonald's because it was predictable, and they felt as though they could exercise full control over how the meal would be, what kind of experience it would be. Today, to a foodie, McDonald's is nasty. I wonder if we could reach a point where sending text messages, having important conversations, not errand conversations, not functional conversations, but actual meaning ones over text message or over Facebook, could be kind of the Velveeta of human interaction. Could we change people's tastes, not to where they shied away from something threatening, but to where they hungered for something that was higher quality? I hold on to this, hopefully, and it's possible we can influence in that direction, and it's possible that it may just be that we have to sit back and hope that we reach that point through a natural rebalancing.